They taped a violation notice to my cabin door like I was some trespassing drifter who'd fished one too many times off the wrong dock. No knock, no welcome, just an HOA threat in 24-point font, demanding I bring the structure into community compliance within 30 days or face escalating penalties. Honestly, I almost framed it, because when someone drunk on bylaw power thinks they can erase history with a printout, you know you're about to enter Act 1 of a real estate soap opera. Welcome to Silver Pine, where people care more about exterior paint palettes than basic human decency. It wasn't just a notice. They'd paper cut the first punch. Drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from, porch, pickup, or HOA surveilled living room. If you're into true-feeling tales where the bad guys get blindsided and justice comes wrapped in land deeds and sarcasm, smash that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story? Let's just say, it makes today look like a warm-up round. And what's coming next? Let's just say the HOA really didn't know. I'm Miles Harland, and I didn't move out here looking for a fight. I came to Silver Pine to inherit a cabin, not a conflict. My Uncle Reuben left it to me after he passed, a quiet man who could outstare a storm and win. Lived here for decades, knew every inch of the land better than his own reflection. I figured I'd spend some peaceful weekends fixing the porch, maybe relive some childhood summers, maybe breathe air that didn't taste like city stress. Instead, I got hit with a citation list so long it needed its own zip code. They hated everything from the color of my siding to the age of my truck. I was starting to think my grandfather clock might get written up next. Apparently, heritage has no place in a lakeside subdivision with matching mailboxes and pre-approved grass height. Then came Lynette Cartwright, HOA president, queen of paper cuts. She showed up in tennis whites, waving a welcome packet like it was a restraining order. This community has aesthetic expectations, she said, eyeballing my native shrubs like they were leeches. I told her I wasn't planning on swapping wildflowers for AstroTurf just to match her magazine spread. That's when she smiled the way someone does before they call a tow truck on a perfectly legal vehicle. She didn't see a neighbor. She saw a threat to her lakeside brochure. There's a look some folks give you when they think money makes their opinion a law. She wore that look like it was tailored. And her husband, Thomas? The type who probably drinks bottled water from imported glaciers and considers himself a visionary because he owns 2 drones and a tie with his name embroidered on it. I figured it was just a misunderstanding. A weird, overly landscaped misunderstanding. Then the notices kept coming. $200, 0 cents fine for non-uniform landscaping, $500, 0 cents for unauthorized bird feeder. I started to wonder if they were just inventing nouns at this point. My personal favorite? Excessive porch character. Not kidding, they wanted to fine me for having too much charm. Imagine getting ticketed for being the only person on the block with a soul. I started collecting these notices like baseball cards. Someday they might be worth something, if only as evidence in a trial for psychological warfare. I didn't come here to fight a war with flower beds and bylaws, but that's exactly what they declared. You ever get fined for using real wood in a neighborhood addicted to vinyl siding? I have. Lynette once fined a man for wind chimes, said they clashed with the architectural harmony. At Silver Pine, personality is a violation, unless it comes pre-approved in the HOA handbook. That night, I sat on the porch, same one Reuben built with his bare hands in '68, watching the lake and drinking coffee strong enough to file a lawsuit. I looked over at the handmade railing, the pine trees whistling like backup singers, and thought, this place doesn't need improvement, it needs defense. What they didn't know was that Uncle Reuben taught me how to read land records like scripture, and buried in a filing cabinet inside this modest cabin was a secret waiting to shake their kingdom of mulch and mailboxes. I didn't bring trouble with me, but I brought a filing cabinet, and that was more dangerous. They said my mailbox was non-compliant. It's a mailbox. It holds mail. What else is it supposed to do? HOA meetings here sound like budget hearings for a dictatorship. You speak, they fine, but I wasn't raised to flinch. And I certainly wasn't raised to sell. This cabin wasn't just a structure, it was a statement. and I was about to teach them that some property lines are drawn with ink and some with resolve. Uncle Reuben once told me, "The only thing an HOA fears more than a lawyer is a homeowner who actually reads the land deed." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic, like the kind of man who saves receipts from 1973 just in case the toaster company comes back around. But standing there, ankle-deep in violation notices and passive-aggressive newsletters, I finally understood, because tucked inside the bottom drawer of Reuben's battered metal filing cabinet wasn't just paperwork. It was a map of a quiet rebellion. And the more I read, the more I realized Silverpine had been built on a bluff. And not just the geographical kind. If they thought I was going to fold because they threw a few fines and frowns my way, they really hadn't read the right paper. The documents were crisp, official, and terrifying for them. Turns out, Uncle Reuben didn't just own the cabin and a sliver of grass around it. He owned 60% of the lake bed itself, the entire north shoreline, including the rickety community dock everyone treated like shared property, his. And the cherry on top? The HOA Clubhouse, yes, the one where Lynette held court like a suburban Cleopatra, was sitting squarely on land leased from Reuben, and that lease had quietly expired 3 years ago. They were hosting wine tastings on ground they didn't legally occupy. I couldn't make this up if I tried. Suddenly, I wasn't just the guy with excessive porch character. I was the guy with the receipts. And they didn't know it. Yet, that moment felt like finding the deed to your enemy's castle while they're still polishing the drawbridge. Of course, they moved fast. Bullies usually do when they sense resistance. I got a notice about a mandatory HOA meeting to discuss property appearance and community cohesion. Translation: a public shaming. I showed up early and quiet, sat near the back with a pen and a legal pad like a good citizen. Lynette was up front next to her husband and a sharp-eyed man introduced as Victor Green, HOA legal counsel. "We pride ourselves on Silverpine's visual harmony," she began, clicking through a slideshow like she was pitching beachfront timeshares. Then, there it was. My cabin on screen, shot from the worst possible angle. I swear they waited for a cloudy day and tilted the camera just enough to make it look haunted. "This property," she said without even using my name, "represents a challenge to our shared vision." A challenge? No, a mirror. They just didn't like what it reflected. When the lawyer took over, the room got quieter. He explained, calmly, too calmly, that continued non-compliance could result in escalating fines, property liens, or, if necessary, legal action. That word, necessary. As if bulldozing someone's inheritance is a civic duty. I kept my mouth shut, but my heart was pounding like a warning drum. See, they didn't know yet what I had, and something Reuben taught me years ago echoed in my head. You don't move your queen until the board is quiet. So I smiled, nodded, and said nothing. Because while they were busy drawing battle lines in PowerPoint, I was sitting on the deed that could flip the whole damn board. The audience didn't know it yet, but the underdog was holding the title to the arena. Walking out of that meeting, I felt the weight of 2 generations on my shoulders, but also something else. Momentum. This wasn't just about fines anymore. It was about legacy, leverage, and land. And the contrast was so clear it could have been a billboard. They built PowerPoints, I held paper. They had bylaws, I had boundaries. And next? Well, let's just say the next move wouldn't be subtle. Because when you own the dirt under their throne, you don't ask permission to stand, you wait. Then you plant a flag they can't unsee. I spent the next day reading those documents like scripture. Every line of survey data, every notarized page, every old ink signature felt like Reuben's way of whispering, "Don't let them rewrite what we built." The lakebed deed was especially powerful, signed during the drought of '77, when water levels dropped so low the exposed shoreline could legally be claimed. Reuben had done just that. While others were building decks and sipping wine coolers, he was down at the county office, planting flags no one else could see. They wanted lakeside access. He bought the lake beneath their feet. What they didn't realize was that the old man had beat them at a game they hadn't even started playing yet. Their slideshow was cute, but their prized dock sat like a rented tuxedo on private property. Their clubhouse, built with fundraising and borrowed assumptions. And now their legal teeth? Victor Green was going to have to bite down on some bitter truth. I didn't need to yell, protest, or organize a coup. I just had to walk into the right room with the right folder. That's the power of receipts in a world run by projection. That evening, I opened a bottle of Uncle Reuben's last homemade moonshine, more kerosene than corn, really, and watched the HOA board meeting replay in my head. They had strutted like peacocks, sure of their dominion. But every bird with feathers forgets gravity, and I had the gravity of documented land rights. I started crafting a quiet plan, document everything, observe their reactions, collect every fine letter, and whisper. And when the time came, I'd tip the scale so slowly they wouldn't even feel the shift until the floor disappeared beneath them. A few neighbors whispered encouragement as they left the meeting, but most just avoided eye contact. That's the thing about HOA rule. People fall in line not because they believe, but because they're tired. Tired of arguing, tired of fees, tired of feeling watched. But Reuben didn't raise me to be tired. He raised me to be rooted. And now I had the evidence, the backbone, and frankly the rage to make things right. They thought I'd fold like a lawn chair, but I was the tree they never bothered to map, and now my roots were under their whole operation. The next morning I made 3 copies of the deed, the lake bed claim, and the old lease agreement. One stayed in my safe, one went to my attorney, and that one I slid into a sealed envelope labeled for HOAIs, eventually. Because timing, like land, is everything. Let them keep barking, let them keep fining. They didn't know the foundation under their kingdom was borrowed, and I was done lending. The next move would echo, not because it was loud, but because it would land where it hurt, their illusions of control. It started with firewood, a stack, neatly arranged, seasoned oak, just like Reuben always kept it, dry and ready for a proper winter. The violation slip called it a flammability hazard. I suppose by that logic, a kitchen is a gas leak waiting for an alibi. But I let it go. Thought maybe it was a new guy on the board flexing the rule book. Then came the next one, my truck. The same blue pickup Reuben drove since the Reagan years. They called it an unlicensed relic. Said it disrupted the uniform appearance of the community. Funny, no one said that when Reuben drove it in the 4th of July parade. But I smiled, nodded, and waited. Because when the ridiculous becomes routine, the punchline's usually around the corner. By the end of the week, I'd received 6 violations. 6! 1 for a bird feeder. They claimed it attracted unregulated wildlife, as if the birds needed permits to exist. Another for having a broom leaning against the cabin, visible from the road. My personal favorite? Inconsistent porch shadows. I don't know if they wanted me to control the sun or the rotation of the earth, but apparently my shade wasn't aesthetically aligned with community guidelines. It wasn't a neighborhood anymore, it was a bourgeois terrarium with binoculars, and they'd declared me the local invasive species. The notices came so regularly, I started thinking of the mailman as my passive-aggressive pen pal. One afternoon, while I was splitting logs out back, I noticed a glint up in the pines, something metallic. I climbed a ladder and found a motion-sensitive camera zip-tied to a branch, aimed square at my cabin like I was on an episode of HOA Surveillance Live. And it wasn't the only one. 3 cameras total. 1 in the tree line, 1 by the dock, 1 tucked inside a birdhouse that had no birds. They weren't just writing citations now, they were building a case. That's when I called Savannah Klein. Savannah was sharp. Ex-military intelligence turned property attorney, with a voice like smooth gravel and a habit of asking questions that made people sweat. She came out to the cabin, took one look at the camera logs and said, "They're not protecting property values. They're conducting psychological warfare. She advised me to document everything, photos, videos, timestamps. We're not just gathering evidence, she said. We're creating a timeline of absurdity. I liked her already. Her energy didn't say, sue them later. It said, play chess while they're still arguing over checkers. The violation notices kept coming like clockwork, each more ridiculous than the last. $150, 0 cents for having wind chimes audible beyond 20 feet, $400, 0 cents for unharmonized fencing material, Reuben's old cedar posts that had outlived most of the board members. By the end of the month, I was staring at a $3,000, 0 cents fine summary that read like a satirical script. But the absurdity turned to something darker when one of my cameras caught a figure scratching something into my truck's side. Zoom in. Thomas Cartwright, Lynette's husband. HOA co-conspirator, full blazer, khakis, and a key he used like a scalpel. That's when the chessboard started to shift. I reviewed the footage a dozen times. There was no mistaking the gait, the posture, or the smug pause before he etched the word leave across the door with his key. Thomas didn't just vandalize the truck. He branded it, like he owned the block and I was the stray. Savannah nearly smiled when I showed her the footage. This isn't just a civil matter now, she said. This is criminal damage with intent to intimidate. She drafted a report and told me to save a copy for the sheriff. I did, and for good measure, I saved a few on USBs, one for every neighbor who might suddenly get curious. The next morning, I received a new letter from the HOA. Not a violation this time, a community harmonization directive, which is HOA language for an ultimatum. They wanted me to either bring my property into visual and structural conformity within 14 days or face formal lien procedures. They even included a mock-up drawing of how my cabin should look: gray vinyl siding, white shutters, and some soulless shrubbery clipped into cubes. It looked less like a home and more like a failed real estate brochure for Stepford. That's when I decided the real show was about to begin. Meanwhile, I decided to play a little game of my own. I placed decoy items in visible spots: a broken chair leg on the porch, a garden gnome with a paint chip, a fake extension cord draped across the railing. Each morning, like clockwork, a new citation would arrive. They were biting every bait I laid out. Savannah laughed when I showed her the stack. "You're not fighting back," she said. "You're baiting a trap. Keep going." So I did, and I started recording every delivery, every trespass, every passive-aggressive pamphlet tucked into my screen door like it was scripture. Neighbors started noticing too. A few came by pretending to return tools or ask about the truck. But underneath the small talk, I could see it. The unease, the questions. One guy, Dale, leaned in and whispered, "They're watching all of us now, not just you." I nodded, but they picked the wrong porch to start a war on. That's when Ellie, my neighbor across the cove, offered to let me mirror her security footage. We linked up our cameras. Her angle caught something mine hadn't: a second person watching as Thomas keyed my truck. Back up. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was a pattern, a campaign. And it had moved past citations into real intimidation. Savannah filed a formal complaint with the county that week. I submitted the camera footage as evidence, along with timestamps, photos of the truck, and violation log. And still, the HOA pressed on. Either oblivious to the law or too arrogant to believe it applied to them. But something was shifting. At the next board meeting, several residents didn't just look uncomfortable, they looked embarrassed. The final straw came when I found a fresh citation taped to the bird feeder. Yes, the same one already flagged for wildlife inducement. This one was for environmental disruption via overhanging shadow. I'm not kidding. The shadow of a bird feeder. I stood there with the slip in one hand and my coffee in the other and laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it confirmed everything Reuben ever warned me about. They don't want to protect beauty, he once said. They want to manage it, like they invented nature and now they license it. So I pinned that last citation on my fridge like a trophy and circled the date. Because next week, we go public. And when I say public, I mean hearings, press, depositions, everything these clipboard tyrants thought they'd never have to answer for. They turned my cabin into a battleground, but they forgot one thing: I don't scare, and I sure as hell don't sell. They wanted a fight? They just got front row seats to the opening act. They say memory lives in objects, but sometimes it's hiding under them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I'd pinned every violation notice on the wall like some detective tracking a serial meddler, but the absurdity had hit a point where I just needed air. I walked down to the old dock Reuben built by hand, sat at the edge with my feet dangling over the water, and tried to remember the last summer I'd spent there with him, and then I saw it. Not a memory, but a glint, just beneath the lowest plank, tucked into the shadows like a secret waiting for breath. Inside was a metal box, sealed in waxed canvas. I pried it open and found a flash drive, several photos, original tax survey maps, and a letter folded so tight the creases felt like they'd been pressed by time itself. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "they finally pushed too far." It was Reuben's handwriting, tight and stubborn. He'd written everything out: how the HOA had tried to buy him out a dozen times, how they wanted to convert the lake into a private resort, and how he'd documented every inch of shoreline, every legal angle, every encroachment attempt. It was a land war, disguised in wine nights and bylaws. There was one sentence that stuck to my ribs like cold bread. "You're holding the queen now, Miles. Don't move until they show their king." That letter wasn't just advice, it was strategy. I spent the next morning scanning everything. The flash drive had PDFs of deeds, time-stamped emails between Reuben and county officials, and photos of the lake at its lowest point during the 1977 drought, when Reuben bought the exposed bed outright. This wasn't just backup, it was proof. It was legal cement under their HOA castle, and I was the one holding the trowel. Later that evening, while reviewing camera footage, I caught a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Lynette and Thomas were standing at the shoreline just past the dock. "The eviction notice goes out Friday," she said. "Once we get that cabin off the books, Silver Heights can start Phase 2. Exclusive lakefront access." Thomas nodded like a man who thought contracts were written in pencil. "Once it's ours, we demolish. Fast. Build that boardwalk, expand the clubhouse. We'll rename the dock, make it luxury branded." I hit pause, heart thudding. They weren't just trying to kick me out. They were erasing Reuben, and they had no idea I'd already found the receipts. That night, I drove into town and found Frankie Denton at the Silver Spoon Diner. You can't miss Frankie, tall, thin as a rake, and always dressed like he wandered out of a Western film reel. "Reuben's boy," he asked. "Well, I'll be. Pull up a chair, son." Frankie's the town historian and human filing cabinet. I handed him copies of the lake bed deed and photos of the drought maps. He looked them over like a jeweler checking for cracks in a diamond. "This here's gold," he said. "They might talk fast and dress sharp, but land doesn't lie." Frankie pulled out an old scrapbook from his bag, one of those cracked leather ones with yellowing corners, and flipped to an article from 1978. "Local man claims lake bed during drought." There was Reuben, standing with a county official and holding a sign that read, "Pendleton." Not exactly subtle. Frankie tapped the photo. "I was the one who notarized this transaction. We kept records at the courthouse, but I always made a copy for myself." "Reuben asked me to," the man grinned. "He said, if the day ever came when lies outnumbered laws, someone better have the facts." Driving back from the diner, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Stillness. Not quiet. Stillness. Like the moment before a chess piece is lifted and you already know the board just changed. I made extra copies of everything, digital, physical, off-site, because when they realized I wasn't bluffing, I needed my facts lined up like dominoes, ready to topple theirs. But the villains always play their hand too soon. And sure enough, the next morning a certified letter landed in my mailbox like a fly on soup. Formal eviction, Stamped, signed, supposedly, by me. A release of property rights back to the HOA. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so perfectly timed. Savannah looked at the document and let out a low whistle. This is forgery. Sloppy, too. The signature doesn't match, the dates don't align, and they even used the wrong parcel ID in one clause. These people are desperate. She handed the papers back like they were a bad script. We're going to need a hearing, and not just a civil one. I walked back to the dock, held the forged eviction in one hand and Ruben's real deed in the other. The symbolism hit hard. They wanted to rename the dock, level the cabin, put up glass and chrome where old pine once grew. But that dock's built on history, on drought maps and boundary lines, and a man too stubborn to sell out. And they didn't just underestimate me. They underestimated the documents, the paper trail, the time capsule, the story in the soil. They were writing fiction on top of fact, and facts don't bend without breaking bones. So I pinned the fake eviction on my wall next to the real deed. Contrast makes the truth brighter. Then I called Savannah and Frankie and we mapped out the opening moves. We hit them with proof before they know the court date's been set, Savannah said. Then let's make sure the press sees it too, Frankie added. I smiled, looking out at the water where the moon hit the wood. They wanted to drown my legacy in paperwork and plexiglass, but the only thing sinking next is them. In the morning of the hearing, I put on Ruben's old leather belt. Not for luck, just for lineage. Some folks carried briefcases into court. I carried a folder so thick it needed its own seatbelt. The courthouse was already buzzing when I arrived. Local news vans parked outside, neighbors pretending they just happened to be there, and Lynette pacing like a CEO waiting on a hostile merger. It wasn't just my day, it was the day the HOA's greatest hits were finally getting a live audience, and this time, the mic was mine. Savannah was already inside, organizing exhibits like a general laying out a battle map. "We're going first," she said, barely looking up. "You ready?" I nodded, because I wasn't just walking into a hearing, I was walking into the final act of a bad play I never auditioned for. But now? I had the receipts, the script, and the spotlight. The judge called it to order, and Savannah stepped up like she'd done this 100 times because she had. "Your Honor," she began, "we intend to demonstrate not only that Mr. Miles Rowan is the rightful owner of the lake bed, the dock, and the land under the HOA's clubhouse, but also that he has been subject to a coordinated campaign of harassment, surveillance, and attempted fraudulent eviction." She let that hang for a second before calling the first witness, me. I laid out the story. Ruben's land, the drought purchase, the expired lease, then the cameras, the forged signature, and the kicker? A breakdown of HOA fines that had ballooned to over $3,000, 0 cents for crimes like inconsistent porch shadows and overactive wind chimes. The courtroom chuckled, and the judge raised an eyebrow. "You have documentation for these?" Savannah placed the stack on the desk with a satisfying thump. "Exhibit C through M, Your Honor." Then came June. Bless her, she marched in with her cardigan, her teaching badge, and a binder full of water samples. "Every year I take my students down to the lake for spring ecology tests," she said. "And for the last 3 years, our results from the North Shore have shown elevated levels of runoff chemicals, specifically construction toxins. Those samples align with the Silver Heights development timeline." Savannah leaned in. "Were those levels ever reported to the HOA?" June nodded. "Twice. They said it was within seasonal variance. I've got emails. They were ignored both times. The HOA had bigger fish to fry, namely their upscale lakefront brochure." June held up a laminated chart. "It's not just about pollution, it's about ecosystem collapse. The fish are disappearing, the lily pads are browning, and water clarity has dropped every year." When she sat down, even the HOA's lawyer looked like he'd swallowed a tack. Frankie was next. He brought the hammer, walked up to the stand with a copy of the 1978 article and the notarized deed like he was presenting a family Bible. "Your Honor, I was the county's historical archivist when Reuben Rowan legally acquired this lakebed. I personally filed the deed and maintained copies in our certified archives." He adjusted his bolo tie. "It's never been disputed. Until these folks built a clubhouse on top of it." Murmurs swept the room like a sudden breeze. Then Savannah dropped the final blow. Surveillance footage of Thomas keying my truck, and Victor, the HOA's own attorney, caught on camera removing my survey flags. The room went silent. She laid the USB drive down like it was a detonator. "This isn't just a land dispute. This is a pattern of intimidation and deceit." And for once, Lynette's smile vanished. The judge looked at the documents, then at us, then back at the HOA. "Mr. Green," he said, addressing their now visibly sweating attorney, "do you have a rebuttal?" Green stood slowly, adjusting his collar like it had just tightened 3 sizes. "We respectfully request additional time to review the documents presented." Translation: stall, delay, hope we trip. But the judge had had enough. Request denied. And just like that, the gavel came down. The court recognizes Mr. Rowan's legal ownership of the lakebed dock and adjacent shoreline. The HOA's eviction is invalid. Any further enforcement actions will be subject to immediate legal penalty. Furthermore, I'm referring the matter of surveillance, vandalism, and forgery to the county prosecutor. The gallery broke into murmurs, half stunned, half thrilled, and for the first time in weeks, I exhaled like a man who remembered what peace felt like. Outside, the press swarmed like seagulls at a beach picnic. I didn't say much, just enough. "This wasn't about rebellion," I told one reporter. "It was about stewardship. Reuben didn't build a cabin to be conquered. He built a sanctuary worth defending." Lynette shoved past the crowd without a word. "And Thomas?" He pretended to take a phone call from no one. But my favorite moment came quietly. Frankie, June, Savannah, and I stood by the truck. Yes, the same one with a scratch still visible under the word leave. June touched the hood gently. "Funny how they tried to erase history," she said, "and ended up putting it on trial." I nodded. Because the real verdict wasn't about land. It was about dignity and legacy. And the quiet, stubborn power of people who don't bluff. Back at the cabin, I pulled the old deed from the frame I'd built and placed it next to Reuben's letter. I didn't need to read it again. I knew every line, but I did glance at the bottom one more time. "You're holding the queen now, Miles. Don't move until they show their king." Well, they showed it, and the board broke under pressure. Now the lake was quiet again, not silent, just right. Birds returning, neighbors waving. And the dock? Still standing, still ours. I didn't just win a hearing. I burned the blueprint of their fake empire, one truth at a time. And I wasn't done yet. Because the next act, it's not a courtroom drama anymore, it's a reckoning. The smoke had cleared, but the story wasn't over. After the ruling, the Silver Pine HOA board scattered like ants after a boot stomp. Lynette resigned within a week, citing health reasons, and Thomas quietly transferred his development company's assets to a Delaware shell. Victor flipped like a breakfast pancake, offered full cooperation to the prosecutor in exchange for immunity, and rumor had it he'd already started writing a memoir. But the best part? The community finally took a breath and opened its eyes. At the next HOA election, which felt more like a town hall revival, I was nominated as honorary steward of the lake. No official power, just the job of watching over it the way Reuben did, with respect, grit, and a strong lock on the dock gate. Ellie gave the nomination speech, Frankie seconded it, and the applause, that was more than noise. That was restoration. Of land, yes, but also of sense. The new board voted unanimously to rename the dock Thornton Pier. A plaque now rests at the entrance, reading, "In memory of Reuben Harland Rowan." He didn't just own the lake, he protected its soul. I cried when they unveiled it, quietly, behind sunglasses, because there's something about watching a legacy get its due, something that makes your chest ache and your spine straighten all at once. Like finally fitting the last piece into a 1,000-piece puzzle only one man could have imagined. With the settlement money from the defamation and harassment claims, I didn't buy a new car, didn't sell the land, didn't build a rental empire. I bought solar panels and rainwater collectors. I reinforced the cabin's foundation and upgraded the septic without disturbing a single root. And that old truck, I had it polished but not repainted. The scratch still says leave, and I did. I left it there, because scars are stories too. The best change came quietly. No newsletters, no fireworks, just kids fishing off Thornton Pier, neighbors planting native flowers, people actually waving again. The lake didn't just recover, it exhaled. You could hear it in the breeze and see it in the water. And the cabin? Still modest, still strong, still mine. 1 year later, they held a lake celebration. No speeches, no permits. Just grilled corn, live music, and laughter. That night, I rowed out into the lake with Reuben's old oars and let the silence carry me. The silence out there wasn't empty. It was full, like the quiet after a symphony, where even the stillness carries music. I dipped the oars in slowly, water curling off them like ribbon. The moon was just climbing, shy but proud. Somewhere behind me, the cabin light glowed soft. I could almost hear Reuben's voice. The lake never lies, Miles. It only reflects. That night, it reflected peace. Earned peace. A few months later, the county approved the conservation easement I'd filed for, the entire North Shore. Protected. No more condos. No more cement trucks rumbling through morning mist. Just lake, trees, and time doing what time does best. Heal. It wasn't flashy, wasn't newsworthy, but when June brought her students back that spring, the fish counts were up, the lilies had returned, and the water was clear enough to see the stones again. Dave, now president of the HOA, called it a reset. I called it justice by degrees. One choice at a time, we turned a Cold War into a warm handshake. Policies were rewritten, community guidelines stripped of the absurd, and the phrase porch shadow was officially retired from violation language. They even created a neighborhood history archive, with Reuben's journal as the first entry. Frankie cried again. So did I. Savannah moved on to a case in Colorado, but not before she came by the cabin one last time. She stood on the porch, looking at the lake, sipping coffee. "You ever think about selling?" she asked, just to poke me. "Every time I hear a leaf blower at 6 a.m., I replied. But then I remember, peace and quiet don't list on Zillow. She laughed, saluted me with her mug, and drove off into the mist like some legal cowboy riding west. Sometimes people stop by and ask me what it cost, not in dollars, but in time, stress, tension, and I tell them the cost of not selling is high, but the cost of giving up? That's generational. You don't get a second shot at protecting a place once it's gone. The bulldozers don't apologize, and bylaws don't have reverse gears. So, yeah, I stayed. I fought. And I inherited more than land. I inherited obligation and honor. Every now and then I get a letter from someone in another town, another HOA. They heard the story, watched the clip, read the article. What would you do? They ask. And I tell them, read your deed, know your rights, plant something native. And when the letter shows up taped to your door, don't back down. Just breathe deep, find your oars, and row like hell. Because this place, it's more than a map dot. It's proof that sometimes the good guy wins. That legacy isn't about bronze statues or big bank accounts. It's about what you protect when nobody's watching. What you refuse to sell because you know someone else paid the price to keep it whole. On the anniversary of the ruling, we held another gathering. No one called it a party, but it felt like one. They unveiled a new wooden sign at the trailhead, Thornton Lake Preserve. Underneath, in small brass lettering, guarded by the stubborn. Reuben would have hated the attention, but he would have loved the message. I stayed out late that night. The music faded, the lights dimmed, but I lingered, walked the dock alone, touched the plaque, let my fingers trace the engraved letters. Then I sat, pulled Reuben's oars from under the bench, and eased out onto the water one more time. No speeches, no applause, just the creak of wood and the hush of oars slicing water. And as I drifted into the center of the lake, moonlight washing the dock behind me and pine silhouettes framing the shore, I whispered something I hadn't said out loud since the beginning. Thank you. To Reuben, to the lake, to the quiet. Not all wealth is in acres. Some is in the quiet nerve to protect what matters. You know, I didn't set out to become some small-town legend or thorn in an HOA's side. I just wanted to honor a man who taught me that land isn't about fences and fines, it's about roots and legacy, and the kind of quiet courage that doesn't make headlines but changes everything anyway. Reuben didn't leave me money. He left me a map, not just of boundary lines, but of how to stand up when standing down would be easier. And maybe that's the point of all this. Some stories ain't about winning. They're about not walking away when something sacred is on the line. So if this story meant something to you, if you felt that twist in your gut when the camera caught them vandalizing my truck, or that rush when the judge slammed down the gavel in my favor, then you're part of it now too. Because stories like this, they don't just entertain. They remind us what it means to belong, to protect, to persevere. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, or if you've ever stared down your own HOA headache and lived to tell the tale. Like this video if you believe legacies are worth defending. And subscribe if you want more real-feeling stories with justice, irony, and just the right amount of sweet revenge. Because next time, let's just say the clipboards are coming, but this time, the underdog has a bulldozer.